You wanted the best. You've got the best podcast. The hottest podcast in the world. The Chris Voss Show, the preeminent podcast with guests so smart you may experience serious brain bleed. Get ready. Strap yourself in. Keep your hands, arms, and legs inside the vehicle at all times, because you're about to go on a monster education roller coaster with your brain. Now, here's your host, Chris Voss.
Hi, folks. Chris Voss here from thechrisvossshow.com, thechrisvossshow.com. Hey, we're coming here with another great podcast. We certainly appreciate you guys tuning in. Be sure to give us a like, subscribe to us on youtube.com. If you're listening to the audio version of this on all of our podcast syndication channels, you can watch the video version of this on youtube.com/Chris Voss. So cool. Embrace technology. It's pretty cool. You can even use your phone for that as well. Anyway, guys, refer the show to your friends, neighbors, relatives, dogs, cats. Get them involved. Get them to listen to the show. Sign them up. Go to the ECVPN or Chris Voss Podcast Network.com. I've been seeing some great referrals for the show. People giving us 5 stars. So we certainly appreciate the folks going to iTunes and doing that. We'll give you a shout out tomorrow on some of the people who have been doing that. And also, we have, of course, the most excellent guests in the world, like the whole world. We search the whole world for the most excellent guests, and we mine them, and then we bring them to you. And one is here today. It's Stefanie Johnson, or I should say, Dr. Stefanie K. Johnson. She's a researcher focused on the intersection of leadership and diversity, and she works with the best companies to implement evidence-based procedures to reduce unconscious bias and increase inclusion. And we've actually been talking about this a lot with Black Lives Matter and some of the discussions we've been having, so this is a great segue into the discussions we're having in our social life around the world. She's a member of the MG 100 Coaches and was selected for the 2020 Thinkers 50 Radar list. She's the author that we'll be talking about, the nation's bestseller, Inclusify, harnessing the power of uniqueness and belonging to build innovative teams. She publishes her work in the top journals and received $3.8 million in external grant funding. She has represented her work at over 170 meetings around the world, including the White House for a 2016 Summit on Diversity in Corporate America. Media outlets feature Stefanie's work, include The Economist, Newsweek, Time, Wall Street Journal, CNN, ABC, NBC, everywhere. She's been everywhere. She's appeared on Fox, ABC, NBC, CNN, and CNN International. So welcome to the show, Stefanie. How are you?
I'm well. Thanks for the very kind introduction.
There you go. Or I should just probably call you Dr. Johnson, huh?
No, please call me Stefanie or Steph.
All right. Sounds good, Steph. And Stefanie, give us your .coms where people can look you up on the interwebs.
Mm-hmm. On drstefjohnson.com, DRSTEF Johnson, and inclusifybook.com, and then the corresponding hashtag. So at Dr. Steph Johnson, hashtag Inclusify, on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn.
Awesome sauce. So I've been getting a chance to read your book, but before we get into that, give us just a little background on you, kind of your origin story, what made you get to the point of maybe wanting to be a doctor, and then, of course, writing this wonderful book.
For sure. It's funny that you asked that, because in the book, there's these different archetypes of leaders, and each one starts with the origin. So meritocracy, manager, origin. So I guess this is Stefanie Johnson, origins.
Okay.
I have no idea how I ever decided to go get a PhD and write a book and stuff like that. I'm probably like the least likely person to have a PhD. I grew up near East Los Angeles, pretty poor. Neither of my parents went to college. And I just had this idea when I was a high school student that I wanted to go get a PhD. I wasn't really sure what that even meant, but I never really stopped working toward that goal. So as soon as I went to college, my first year, I told my professors, I want to get a PhD. And they were like, really? That's very strange for a freshman in college to say, but I had read about it on the newly created internet. This was in the 90s, about this whole getting a PhD in psychology. And that's what I ended up doing, even though I'm now a business professor. But I'm just super curious about people and in particular leadership. What makes people follow leaders? Why do we love leaders so much? How can we be better leaders?
Awesome sauce. That you have the same sort of interest that I do. That's the reason I have a podcast, is because I'm curious about people. It's interesting to me the path that people take and the choices they make and what they do with their lives and how they lead them and their motivations and what takes them down that thing. I grew up in a cult of religion, and in leaving that cult, I've always studied like why people believe what they do. Because, I've seen what that looks like in the Jonestown sort of element. And we're seeing some of that now in politics and things that are going on where there's, cults of personality, et cetera, et cetera. And so I've always looked at people, what motivates them to lock onto these things. And of course, leadership is a great thing for me too, because I've been a CEO since I was 18. So I've always owned my own companies, and becoming and preparing for a leader was one of those things that I looked in for.
What made you want to host a podcast? I mean, obviously you're curious about people, but
yeah, and it's because I get to interview people and find out where they go, like where they came from, what motivates them, and to me it's interesting. Like it's a real. I love stories, collecting stories, and so that's always interests me in how that works. So in your book Inclusify, tell us what Inclusify is about.
Yeah, so it's a book about how leaders can be more effective at leading inclusively. Although I guess anyone can read it, even if you're not a leader, but it's really based on my research that I was studying unconscious bias and leadership, and I found overwhelmingly that people had really good intentions, at least when it came to inclusion. I've not met anyone yet who says, no, I actually don't want to be an inclusive leader. I don't want to hear others' opinions. Even people who don't want to hear others' opinions, they don't believe that. And some leaders thought they were doing a really great job. Others recognized they weren't doing that great a job, but they still wanted to. And it just made me realize that this is a huge gap, that we don't teach leaders how to be more inclusive. We just tell them you should be this, and we're not going to define it for you, but your job is going to be based on your success at this. And so I thought this is what we need, is an easy guide of how can I build on my strengths and be more inclusive?
And you do a great job of laying the foundation. When you start out in the book, you talk about, why we kind of have this internal thing where we want to belong, we want to be involved. When you're not invited to the party, you feel that FOMO or you feel excluded and you don't feel a part of something when you want to. And so you lay a good foundation into why this is psychologically important for us.
Absolutely. Yeah. It's like the two most basic and essential human needs, right? Like we all want to be accepted and loved and valued. And it feels so bad when you're not, right? I don't know anyone who hasn't had that experience too, where you're left out. But then at the same time, we want to be ourselves. We don't want to only be accepted if we totally fake everything about ourselves. And so does that create
a dichotomy where, let's say someone's a racist, but they want to be themselves and they want to be included, or cancel culture. I'm not saying cancel culture is bad, but cancel culture where someone's like, well, I want to do whatever I want and be Bill Cosby, and I don't understand why I'm not included.
Yeah, maybe. I like to say you want to be your true best self. So,
okay.
I mean, there's definitely a lot of stuff about me that I'm just going to leave it out of this conversation. I don't think anyone at work needs to see it. I actually don't want anyone to recognize the aspects of myself that are, not my favorite. There's all things that we're struggling to become better people. And I guess I would put racism and raping people in that category.
Definitely.
There's some MQ.
Sadly, I don't know. I'm not a total psychologist, but I would think with mass killers and other things, they do probably prescribe to be the best at what they do. I don't know what was the name of Bill Cosby, but I was just wondering about the psychology of that, of trying to force yourself onto people because you're like, I want to be included, but I want to be me. And that's kind of a broad spectrum of what you want people to accept. And maybe that's the reason for your book and some of the details that are in it is you need to look inside yourself and go, are you really the best person to be putting forward into society and making a contribution, a good contribution, I should say.
Yeah, I think so. It's when I'm talking about bringing your whole self, it's like the core aspects of your identity. Like if you're, kind of a liar, you don't need to bring that, right? It's more of like, I am a woman, I am a parent, I am Hispanic, like all those things that are really central to how I see myself. I think you should be able to bring that. But I had this person on LinkedIn the other day say he was a white guy, and he messaged me. So one of my LinkedIn contacts, hopefully he never watches this, but he said he doesn't think his diversity is included. And he feels like the book, Inclusify, really voices that everyone should be included. And he's like a white guy. So I'm like, lots of white guys have things they're not included for. Like you could have, it could be a disability. It could be being conservative. It could be your sexual orientation. It could have been growing up poor is one of the things that causes people to feel stigma. So he responds with, no, I like to be spanked.
Oh, that sounds like what a lot of women get on the internet. Yeah.
Yes. And I'm like, so that part, don't bring it to work. Like,
yeah. And don't share.
I don't care what you do, but do not share this at work or on LinkedIn with me. I mean,
does he want that like at work where that's accepted or something?
I don't know. I don't know. He just said, can you help me? And I was like, N-O, delete.
Like where do you want to publish that, buddy? It sounds like more like he's,
but if he did write a book about that, I would read it.
Yeah, it would be interesting. Like like 20 or 30 years ago, because I'm old. Let's see, where would I put it? About 20 years ago, I had a friend, and this is before a lot of LGBTQ acceptance and stuff. I mean, this is before, I think, Don't Ask, Don't Tell, or around the Don't Ask, Don't Tell era of the Clinton thing. And a lot of America still wasn't accepting of gay rights and everything. I'm glad they are now. And I had a friend, and she just had a small company of like 2 or 3 people. And a guy one day showed up at her office, or she had an employee for a while. That was a guy. And one day he said, I'm going to show you who I really am. And I'm going to try being who I really am at work. And she's like, okay, we'll show what that's about. Showed up the next day in a dress and makeup and full drag. And he's like, this is who I am. And she's like, well, we're a business, and and we're not really, I mean, it was a challenge. Let's put it that way.
Yeah.
Because he was, whatever. And that was pretty early days to be doing something. I think nowadays you might have some more exclusivity. I don't know. I haven't shown up to work in a dress yet. I'm still working on that.
I know that was one of the interviews I did was with Gap's CEO, and the CEO at the time talked about an employee that he really valued who dressed as a woman, who identified as a man. So he identified as a man, but dressed as a woman, and how like it's important to create a space for people to be able to be that part of their identity. And I think that's different than asking your boss to spank you. But
I think nowadays it's probably more acceptable, and of course there are laws and stuff now that protect LGBTQ people, and I think it's appropriate. But I mean that's an example of sometimes where you're like, whoa, okay, but yeah, spanking definitely might be. We need to keep that away for a while.
That's why I think this is actually, to me, such an interesting topic, because it's always evolving, right? The things that we're talking about now are just so different than in the 90s, like when I learned about the internet.
Yeah. Hopefully that doesn't become a thing, though, because one of my problems used to be was we had so many employees that, every now and then you catch people on the copier, or you'd have problems in the office after hours with people having interpersonal relationships, let's call it that. And I wasn't a big fan of that, especially since it was my office and my copier. So there's that. So let's talk some more about inclusivity. Why is it important? What is the basis of this on why it's important to us in our society and businesses?
Yeah, I guess from the individual perspective, it's important for us to feel included, each person. Otherwise, if you don't feel like people recognize your uniqueness and you feel like you don't belong, there's a lot of psychological distress. Like people feel very invisible. They might feel like they want to quit. They can actually suffer from depression and anxiety for some of those things. So it's obviously it matters to the individual, but then if you scale that up to the organizations that have more inclusion actually outperform other organizations. They have better decision making because people are willing to voice different perspectives. They have lower turnover because people aren't quitting all the time because they feel like they can't be themselves. They have greater innovation because they do have like difference breeds creativity. So that I think all organizations would be elevated if we could actually bring out that inclusion.
A rising tide lifts all boats. That's what I always say.
I think so. Yeah. And then leaders, it's for them, it's like, this is your job, dude. Like your job as a leader is to bring all your employees with you and help every one of them be as successful as possible. That's what you signed up for if you're a leader. So I think this is just another skill that people need to work on. Not, it's not different from learning how to give feedback or how to create schedules. Like this is just something that in 2020 with a very diverse workforce that we all need to be working on to do better.
And it's important too, because I mean, as a leader or as a head of a corporation or a manager or any place in the organization, you want to take advantage of everyone's ability to work, everyone's ability to contribute. One of the rules of my companies was, I don't have all the ideas. Everyone has an idea. There was no dumb questions. Everyone, I didn't care where the great ideas came from because the less burden it was on me to come with all ideas was great.
Yeah.
And so being able to have, a corporation or a society work at its fullest means, making inclusion for everyone so they can contribute and they can feel a part of it. I remember in the 90s, we had to start, dealing with sexual harassment and different things like that because that excludes people and makes them feel alienated, or women's rights, women's issues, how they're treated in the workplace, et cetera, et cetera. We just had a great interview yesterday regarding some of that. So, I had to learn all that stuff and go, hey, so this is a part of how we have a healthy environment, making sure that everyone feels included, everyone feels like they're contributing, everyone's not being marginalized in some way, shape, or form. And that became really important then and even more important now where we're dealing with race relations, LGBTQ, just making sure everyone contributes. You talk in your book about how sometimes people show up at meetings and they get kicked out of the meeting because someone thinks that they're not shouldn't be in that meeting. They find out later they're not, but you talk about how that rejected person's feelings. One interesting thing you talk about in the book was how at an event, a gentleman went to a CEO after party or something of that nature, or some sort of event, and when he opened the door, the CEO thought that he was help staff from the hotel, and said, we don't need anything. Yeah. And that destructive element of kicking one's self-esteem and making someone feel excluded is hurtful, and it lowers productivity.
Yeah, and that was a tough story. It was a Black man, I don't name him in the book, but who was worked in finance and was from the South, and like most, the big financial firms are in New York. And so he was at this conference and he was invited to this great party. Like maybe you have these things where there's like, oh, wow, I got an invite to this thing. That's a big deal. And so he went up, actually, he said he rang the doorbell in the hotel room. And when the guy hosting the party, who's, the big wig guy, answered the door, he thought that the gentleman was help staff. And so he turned him away. The guy goes downstairs and he's like, oh my gosh, he's just thought I was hotel personnel because I'm Black. That's why. And to me, the part that like hurt was the fact that he didn't want to see that guy again the next day because of the embarrassment. And like that guy shouldn't be embarrassed. Maybe the CEO maybe should be embarrassed, but just that like feeling of like, I think it's shame, right? When people think, oh, it happens a lot, I think, particularly for women and women of color. and people of color that people think they're the support staff or cleaning people. Like some study showed a large fraction of female faculty have been confused for support staff or cleaning staff. And there's like, just, especially I think when you have that feeling of like imposter syndrome already, like, am I supposed to be here? And then people tell you like, no, actually you're not. I think you're a secretary. Copy these things for me.
Yeah. Well, I think even worse, it shows racism or misogyny in the case of women, where people have their either unconscious bias or conscious bias. I mean, we recently saw where one of the congressmen, forget his name, but he said a bunch of ugly misogynistic stuff to AOC.
Yes.
And it was, wholly inappropriate, but you could tell from his comments that there's a lot of misogynistic sort of bias to him. So let's talk about unconscious bias, because one of the challenges that I have is I deal with a lot of people because they speak out on Black Lives Matter. I speak out against racism. I speak out about people that support racism and they're pushing it. And there's a lot of people in our society that have, I call it closet racism, but maybe the more appropriate term is unconscious bias.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I think it's probably both. There's some people with unconscious bias, and there's apparently just a lot of people who are straight up racist, right?
Yeah, there's a lot of people straight up racist, and there's a lot of people who have unconscious bias. I mean, the one thing I've learned from your book and a lot of the different discussions I have is I think we all have unconscious bias at some level. And do we ever get fully clear of that? I mean, do we just have to go through a lot of psychotherapy to clean it up? And then we're still going to have some of that?
I think we always have it. It's, I mean, the way I describe it is it's basically a mental association between two things. So if you think of a car, what do you think of? A Corvette, a Ferrari? Like, what's your just
BMW.
car? What is it?
BMW.
BMW, nice. Okay. Other people might think of, a Ford or something, right? Like that's your prototype. And it probably relates to, something, what you've seen. And I use the secretary example. Like, in fact, most secretaries are women. Like, this is a true fact. Or if you look at surgeons and nurses, most surgeons are men, most nurses are women. But it doesn't mean that everyone who's a woman is a nurse, right? And if you see a woman in a hospital, it is more likely statistically that she's a nurse than a surgeon. And those are unconscious biases that you expect the person to, just like you're following the likelihood ratio. And I think that's all the unconscious biases. I don't know that we can work on that, but I think we're still going to be influenced by what we see around ourselves. The part that I see is like where we should focus is the point at which you say, pardon me, nurse, can you call
a doctor?
A doctor, right? I think that's where you can stop and like and I think like when people have these experiences, then for like 6 days later, they're like, oh, I have to remember, like I shouldn't do that. But then we just fall back into our old habits because it's easy. It saves time just to say nurse, and then the nurse says, actually, I'm your surgeon. Good luck. Good luck this afternoon.
That reminds me of a TikTok I just saw last night or the night before. There was a gal who's a doctor, and she's a minority, and she said, I just saved the life of a guy who's covered in KKK tattoos. Wait till he wakes up and finds out who saved his life.
Oh my gosh! Yeah, right.
a woman and a minority. So he's got an awakening going on there. Like hopefully he'll have an epiphany to change his life. So that's interesting to me. So people start down these roads of unconscious bias based upon this sort of data or information that is commonly available. The part where it gets toxic is when people start, like, say, for instance, racially biased or biasing in the business. A good example of racial bias are XYZ minority does this or does that, and that's their classification. We see a lot of I don't know what you call it, modeling or profiling, where, certain news channels will be like, oh, those people do that. And I've heard that sort of thing. Those people do that. I mean, you can even say the thing about white people, white people do this.
Yeah.
There's a lot of thing there, but of course we're a majority, so we're not really persecuted.
Yeah.
It's always kind of interesting when people try and pull that card. But the same is probably true in business, where people go, where maybe, okay, so maybe a good example is I'm a CEO. I kind of think of women as secretarial, like you mentioned. And so when I'm looking at interviews, maybe I favor men on an unconscious bias. Would that be true?
Absolutely. Yeah.
So that's an example of where you should get rid of that.
Yeah. Especially at the C level, if you're interviewing for, potential board members or other members of the executive suite or senior vice presidents. Like the CEO is usually not interviewing secretaries. Yeah. But at that point, the correlation's so strong between white guy and board member, old white guy and board member, older, that it's difficult to overcome that and really see someone who doesn't fit that prototype as a good potential. It just seems weird. I haven't seen any, young female Asian board members. And so when you interview one, it's but I think it's focusing on the criteria that you're looking for rather than just making the Gestalt view of looks like a board member.
Do you have to be aware of you have to, how do you start becoming conscious of your unconscious bias? How do you start digging through that morass?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think interacting with people who are different from yourself will start to turn stereotypes into individuals, right? If you've never met someone of a certain race, all you have is your stereotypes. But when you have friends and colleagues that you get to know that have those differences, then it starts to muddle the stereotype a little bit. But I think I just kind of assume all the time that I have unconscious bias. And so rather than just trying to overcome it, I try to instead focus on changing systems and structures that help me overcome it, because we're bad at overcoming it, right? It's first you have to recognize, oh, this might be a point where I have unconscious bias. And then now your brain is totally preoccupied with that unconscious bias thought. Wait, I have this bias. Does that make me a racist, or am I sexist, or both? And then you're supposed to also be evaluating this person. It's it's too much. So I think if you can actually create systems that do that for you, that strip away the bias, it helps. I think unconscious bias training can help when paired with actions. Conversations, I think, help. If you start read a few of these books or blogs, just read 5 things on Forbes, you'll see the same things come up over and over again. So it starts to become clear pretty quickly what the biases are. And as long as you don't assume you're better than everyone else on the planet, you just have to recognize that you have those biases too. And that's not acceptable, depending on, I guess, on your organization.
Yeah. If you think you're better than everyone else on the planet, that's a whole new level of psychiatry.
That's right. Well, there's people who still say they don't think they have unconscious bias.
Yeah. And that's why it's important they should order your book and read it. And that's the discussion that we've actually been having for a long time here on the Chris Voss Show, especially recently with Black Lives Matter, is unconscious bias. Part of my journey with Donald Trump coming into office was looking at white nationalism and some of the other different things and aspects, some of the different keywords he was using. And so I started to really have to start doing that journey internally. And I had to do the same thing with the Me Too movement. Because at first I was kind of shocked. I didn't understand. I'm people are asking people out on dates and hitting on them, and this is bad. But I didn't understand the monster element of it. I don't send pictures of private parts to the women. I don't know why. Since the beginning of phones, I've known that that's not cool.
Yeah.
And plus, God knows where it's going to end up. Even though I was married, I still wouldn't do it. Because I'm the first time I upset her, that thing's going on the internet.
Absolutely.
And it's just, So Me Too was hard to deal with until I heard the stories. And then once I heard the stories, of Weinstein and that you're just like, okay, there's people that date way differently than me, and that's not even dating that he was doing. But evidently I'm quite the gentleman, I guess. But seeing the horror stories of what was actually going on and the horrible things men have done, over the years, I've yelled at friends that if I catch them sending stuff to people, I'm just like, dude, that's not the way to do this thing. Just ask her out, man. Right. And if she says no, then move on. There's a million fish in the sea. I've been single all my life. I've dated all my life. It's just maybe it's because I'm a salesman, so I just understand the numbers game. So you just go, okay, they're not interested. Next, okay, that's one less person that I know that doesn't like me, which seems that there's a lot. No, I'm just kidding. Did you think Me Too was harder for you to kind of get your head around than the resurgence of Black Lives Matter over the last few months? I've always tried to deal with racism and my racist issues. Being an employer back in the day, of course, you couldn't be racist. We had one of our companies was a mortgage company, so we had to sign the equal rights, equal housing, laws and stuff. And so I understood what those meant. I'd read those documents because I was asking people to sign them in the mass. I'd always studied. I grew up, I've talked about this in a few different things on the show. I grew up seeing racism and having a pretty deep impression of how it was bad. And I even as a child, I was like, why are people so ugly and hateful? Mm-hmm. And I talk about one of the pictures that had a huge impact on me was Martin Luther King standing in his front yard, and there's a burnt cross there, and his 1 to 2 year old child or 3-year-old child is standing next to him, and there's a picture where he holds him. And I remember thinking the empathy of that, going, my God, what is that like? Not only from the child's perspective, but having to explain that as a father. And so, early on, I watched Bobby Kennedy and a lot of people. And so, but even then, I've had to deal with unconscious bias. One of the things I discovered in 2016 with the new president was that, there were certain keywords that were being used that were very white nationalist, very racially biased. And part of what a lot of people have is unconscious bias. When you use words like our culture, mm-hmm. and you're like, that only means certain people's culture, right? I see what's going on there. Me Too. So I was kind of prepared for Black Lives Matter. I supported it when it came out during the Obama years, and I understood what it meant, and everything else. I couldn't figure out why it didn't get traction like it did, but unfortunately we had to go through some ugly stuff to get traction now. But the Me Too thing kind of caught me by surprise because I'm a gentleman. I date. I don't date as much as I used to when I was younger and thinner, but I've always it's always been a numbers game to me. So you date, you find somebody, you ask them out. I don't even use lines. I just go, hey, you want to go out sometime? There you go. It's not complicated. You still make it complicated. If a girl wants to go out with you, she'll go out with you. So Me Too was hard, but then once I started hearing the stories and the horror, then I was like, there's some really jerky guys in this world. There's some real jerks. And they are some ugly, nasty people who need to get kicked to the thing. That was hard, but then I had to gear my brain around it. And then I had to start saying, what unconscious biases do I have? Is there toxic masculinity that I have? Is there attitudes that I have towards women? What are my attitudes? That whole sort of discussion. One thing I did shortly after Trump became president was I did this on my own. I sat down and I said, I'm going to start looking at faces. So when I go to the store, I'm going to look at everyone's face, especially minorities, and I'm going to listen to what I decided about that person. And then I'm going to say, why did I make that choice? Why am I making that choice? And what unconscious bias do I have that's causing me? And is that real or not? Or am I, making really bad judgments on people based upon unconscious bias and prejudice? And it was an interesting experiment. It's taught me a lot because now I do it a lot. So I don't know if that's a smart thing to do, but
maybe that's
it worked for me.
Maybe that's one thing people can do is just you know,
Yeah.
think through the impressions that you're forming and why you're forming them.
Yeah. And it's not fun because sometimes you go, oh, wow. Yeah. Wow. I didn't realize that was, yeah, I'm really making some bad judgments there.
Yeah.
Whether it was the Me Too or whether it's racism. And I had there's a lot of different keywords that are used in prejudice. And there's a lot of different assumptions that people make. The inner city. I've always heard that all the crimes in the inner city, and certain people do certain things. And then of course it's tied to manifest destiny and this whole whiteness of America and this weird 400-year issue that we have in our perception of what our history is or what we think is our history. And the exceptionalism or entitlement or elitism that we think white people think they have. And so it's kind of interesting because a lot of that plays into that unconscious bias. And maybe we need to have inclusivity taught in elementary schools. Just like
I know a lot of schools are doing like anti-racism training and at least at the college level. I don't know about in elementary schools, but I do think this is a conversation we need to have. In the book, I think I say this, but there's a lot of the CEOs I interviewed, and these were people who were doing this like really well. So like Mark Benioff at Salesforce, I think he's a great inclusive leader. Kevin Johnson at Starbucks, he's a great inclusive leader. But they say like, we didn't learn this in college or MBA school or whatever, right? Because think about it, like this hasn't been a conversation. It's like we should all just know, obviously, like you said, don't sexually harass people. That should be obvious. And don't be racist. But I think for the more subtle things, I don't know that people are equipped with what that means and what they're supposed to do. And then like, I kind of think the rules have changed, right? Like I'll say my parents' generation, my mom really talked about as a Mexican American being like really told to try to fit in. So like a lot of her peer groups stopped speaking Spanish, didn't teach their kids Spanish, stuff like that, because they were trying to like fit in. And so that, that was a norm for the times, but try telling that to your millennials or Gen Z, they don't want to fit in. That's not how like they were raised. They were told to like be themselves over and over again. And so it means we don't just have to learn this tough skill of inclusifying. We need to relearn what we were taught before. And that's hard, right? It's not just like if you've never done it before. It's like you've been doing something one way for 20 years. And now all of a sudden people are like, actually, we need you to do something else because this isn't working.
You bring up a good point at cultural changes, and over my lifetime, that's one of the things I've seen so many people have a hard problem with, or even people like me who have to learn and grow and try to adapt to that. I've always been, maybe it's because I come from an entrepreneur sort of brain where I understand that things have to change, things have to get better. As a society, we have to become better. And this is an evolving thing. The beautiful part of America is, we have this free speech. So we have this ability to have these discussions and try and figure out. And sometimes we're pretty and sometimes we're ugly. And hopefully we always, through the zig and zag, as Obama used to put it, we get to where we're supposed to be. One of the things I've been talking about with Black Lives Matter and discussions we've been having, a lot of great African-American writers, is I really think a lot of this stuff needs to be taught at the elemental school sort of level when kids are young, because I know it's being taught in a lot of colleges, but I really think like it needs to be taught when they're young, because a lot of kids that I see that are exhibiting a lot of misogynist or racist elements, they're mirroring from their parents. And so by the time they get to college, that sucker's already laid in to their brain. And so I think it's better that we attack that stuff when you're young. I think there should be full classes on racism. What is it? How not to be one? How to identify it? Inclusivity and being able to look at oneself internally. There should be more psychology stuff. I think when you're two, is to how to look inside yourself and go, why am I the way that I am? and then businesses. I notice a lot of colleges now have inclusivity professors on their things to help make sure that the college is doing that. Should every business have like a inclusivity department now?
I think so. I mean, a lot of them do already have maybe a chief diversity officer or diversity, inclusion, belonging officer.
Mm-hmm.
I think you need it. The CEO, I think, is always really the chief diversity officer, because if they're not behind it, it's really hard to get traction. But in addition to their role in it, there needs to be someone who's carrying out action on diversity and inclusion. And it's not just human resources, because it's overall strategy, right, of the company. Mm-hmm. And human resources to be part of strategy too. But I think the diversity and inclusion is more than just HR, right? It really is. If it's not everywhere, then you're not doing it right. So more and more companies are doing that. And
imagine they're doing internal training and making sure all the employees are up to par on that sort of stuff. And I think that's good. I really do. I'd like to see it teach the younger level, though, of course. But I think it's good. I can't
imagine that happening, though, because like there's still schools where they can't teach evolution, right? Like, you think those schools are going to start teaching anti-racism?
I have one of those problems where I believe in something that's better than it is. Yeah. I'm a John Lennon Imagine type thinker, where I think about what the potentials are for a thing, but evidently I was born a few hundred years too early. So I'm just trying to hopefully get us down the road. But yeah, you're right. I mean, people would be probably fighting it. But it is interesting to map how society changes and evolves, and the struggle people go through. I mean, I went through that struggle with me too, where I'm like, what is this stuff going on? And then of course, like I say, I mean, once you heard the stories, you're like, oh, that's not cool at all, Yeah. And I mean, if you're a guy who's has a lot of misogynistic tendencies and is a real jerk to women, for you, that wasn't a wake up call. For people like me, that was kind of like, what?
Yeah.
There are some real jerks in this world. Attacking or being mean to women because they say no to you because they won't go on a date. Oh my gosh, maybe it's easier for me because I'm a salesman. I don't know. To me, no just means, okay, great, next.
Yep, next.
I used to go out on a Friday night or Saturday night to the clubs. I get 4 or 5 girls' numbers and ask them out, right? And so to me, it was just always a numbers game, and then that way you have a better chance of finding the person you like, as opposing just to attaching to one person, and God knows you may not get along, or, you marry them and then you hate each other for the next 20 years. I didn't want any of that. So I was like, it's a numbers game, million fish in the sea.
Yeah.
You play the numbers and hopefully you find the one. And I guess I'm still searching for something.
Aww. I think that there's still, there's definitely jerks at the nightclub, but I think that Me Too is more like the workplace. So if you applied that and asked out all of your employees, still probably not the best.
Yeah. And you saw a lot of that in the Me Too thing, where I'm trying to think of the interviewer who was asking a lot of employees out and being creepy. Rose, Charlie Rose. Yeah, he got busted he was kind of being creepy with his employees, and
Matt Lauer.
He asked a couple out. Matt Lauer. Wow. Yeah, there you go. Crossing that line and then being retaliatory. I mean, a lot of it was being retaliatory when the women said no, or when the women pulled away, and destroying their careers, destroying them, their reputations, et cetera, and making it so they can't work. Fox News. There you go. That's a whole ball of wax. We just saw a new lawsuit come out on that. I'm not sure they're going to win that one with the reputation they have, but I guess that's their problem. But this is important because not only from just getting the most from all your workers, make sure everyone feels involved, make sure everyone has a high productivity level. And it's also a great way to avoid lawsuits and problems and issues and
so
everything else. I mean, my vision is that we could be this utopian society where we all get along and we all operate logically and cerebral, and our emotions are all connected well, and we just we become the society that lifts everyone up. And I don't know, we all wear white robes or some crap that you've seen in some science fiction movie. We're all like, a better world, But I don't know, like I say, I might be a few thousand years born too.
1,000 now. Yeah. I mean,
I don't know.
I think we can get better. I feel like this is the first time that I'm truly optimistic about the future. Maybe thinking more like you in a positive way, because I think the thing that was hardest to change about businesses when it came to, sexual harassment or gender bias or racial bias was really the status quo. It's like, but this is how we do it. We take all of our candidates out to dinner and drinks before we hire them, right? And sometimes those are situations that lend themselves to inappropriate behavior. And in the last 4 months, how many candidates do you think were taken out to dinner?
I don't know.
None. It's COVID, so right? It's like we've just trashed the way we did everything. It's all different. And now I think that means, okay, that sucks, but it means that we have the opportunity when we build it back together to build it better.
Yeah.
We're like, rethink these things. Do we need to add back the overnight trips, to customers? Do we need to add back the taking people out to the bar? I'll say, like in my field of academia, every job interview you go to is always an overnight because it takes more than one day. You give a presentation, but you always go to dinner and have drinks. I don't know if they just do this. And I've had students who are like, I don't drink. What am I going to do? Right. And you could just say, don't drink, but then like you feel like they're going to be discriminating against you and biased against you because you're not fun. You don't fit the culture. You're not someone they want to have a beer with because you're like, no, I don't want a beer.
There's ways of cheating around that too. I mean, I've had friends that were alcoholics and they would order it on duels, and we understood and supported them because we know what they were like when they were alcoholics.
Yeah.
I mean,
I think in the job interview, there's something different that I remember. I went to, this is like give a talk. It wasn't technically a job interview, but we went out and everyone was drinking and I didn't drink. Not because at the time I wasn't an alcoholic. I don't think I am still, but at the time I wasn't. I was pregnant. So I was like, I really shouldn't drink. But I also didn't tell them I was pregnant because it was like, I don't know if I wanted to disclose that yet. I wasn't very pregnant. And months later, someone told me that they asked if I wanted to drink. And I said, no. And they go, oh, that's right. You're Mormon. And I was like, am I? Like, I didn't think I was. I was like raised Catholic and I think I'm kind of Christian, but they were like, no,
so they took that perception that
they thought, oh, she's from Colorado,
Utah,
and she doesn't drink. And they put the pieces together and decided I was Mormon. It was like,
wow. And it was just because you were pregnant.
And I know that's
wild.
That's wild.
I mean, one of the things I usually do when I'm out to events and stuff, I usually don't drink. I might have a drink just to loosen up a little bit, but I'll cut it off because usually I'm doing business like at big events that used to be held before the coronavirus. And so I'll just have a Coke. And so like if anybody says, what are you drinking? I'm drinking a rum and Coke.
Yeah.
They're not going to taste it. So, they don't know the difference. But no, you bring up an interesting point though. One of the issues with a lot of those different events or, taking someone out to dinner or whatever the case may be, can we fully trust everybody? Like, I've been a CEO of a lot of thousands of employees over the years. I don't know that I could ever, no matter how much I could put people through a whole year's worth of inclusivity training. I'm not sure I trust every single person to go to dinner and not create a scenario for temptation to do something stupid.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So maybe we kind of have to throw out some things, or I don't know. Maybe we just have to make sure that they operate in large groups.
Exactly. I mean, I think the point is we have to figure it out newly again, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because right now we're doing none of it. And so as we start incorporating these things back, we can be a little more thoughtful about how we're doing it. Because I think when these procedures and habits and processes were developed, it was like a very homogenous workforce.
Mm-hmm.
And it made sense. It was fine, but it's not now. And so as we're deciding, like going forward, do we need to do the heavy drinks at all of our conventions? And maybe not, right? Like,
yeah,
it's just a huge opportunity, I think.
Because one thing leads to another, and then they're doing stuff on my copier.
Yes.
So, and I've seen how hard it is in an office, especially with somebody who's very beautiful. I've seen how hard it is to keep guys on the straight and narrow. I mean, I've seen it. One time we had a super hot, very flirty secretary up front, and I could not keep my office guys out of that front area to keep from talking.
Oh, wow.
And she was very flirty, so I couldn't. It was like between both sexes, they were just helping each other out. And so, yeah, I just don't know. Hopefully we could become a more cerebral society where we go, hey man, there's a certain place for certain things. I've always wondered about the issues because prior to sexual harassment and Me Too and stuff, the majority of people that met each other and got married usually was from work, which kind of gives you an idea of how much stuff has been going on there for a while.
Yeah.
And I've always wondered, like, how do we pull back from that, and be able to support Me Too and
yeah, but now we have like online dating when you don't need to date people at work. I think you date people at work because you're there all the time, and it's like that's the only people you have exposure to. But now, while you're at work, you can skim through the dating apps, I guess.
that's what people are doing now. They're cruising their Tinder. But what's the old line from Silence of the Lambs? You covet what you see every day, and that can be a problem.
Yeah, and that's a scary analogy right there.
Yeah, and that familiarity. I mean, you're a woman. You've seen some of the crap that people send you on the internet, I'm sure, or DM you. That's what these people do. Especially stalkers and. I mean, geez, there's some guys that got nothing better to do with their time all day long.
I think it's it's like a power thing. It's like exhibiting power over people.
Is that another unconscious bias or is that a psychology sort of thing?
I think there is an unconscious bias around harassment. And I think it's like this idea, I think it comes from like you use the word toxic masculinity, and like I don't like to say that word, but it's this idea of men have to be dominant, and so when they see women who might like not want to go out with them or might seem equally dominant, they like feel challenged by that. It's challenging the social structure, and so I think they engage in sexual harassment as a way of kind of like getting back at that woman for making them feel maybe insecure or something like that. I think that's where it comes from. Yeah. Fear of rejection. Yeah. Like in one paper I wrote, we called it sexual insecurity. It's like, if you don't want me, then I'm going to like be a jerk to you because I feel hurt by you. And so I'm just going to hurt you back.
And is some of that's probably tied to some unconscious bias of misogyny. Like a woman is always less than me, or a woman is, should be in the kitchen. I come from 50 years ago. So, there was a lot of that we went through in the 80s where, women were rising up, ERA. And so, a lot of men were fighting back on that. Like, I'm the man, I'm supposed to be the earner, And so I watched that whole thing go down when I was growing up, and men having to come to this issue of like women can be in the workforce too, they can be contributing, they can everyone can do whatever they want. I mean, now we're starting to see a lot more stuff in our society where men can be stay-at-home moms, if you will. I remember I think it was in the 80s or early 90s, there was it Mr. Mom, that movie that came out?
I think there was Mr. Mom, and then also there's one with like 3 guys, right? 2 men and a baby or something.
3 men and a baby.
3 men and a baby, that's right, there's 3 of them.
Yeah, and that was like culturally like boom.
I know.
People are like, whatever. But I think a lot of those guys have some unconscious biases that base around their triggers where they see women as lesser in some way, shape, or form. And I think they were raised that way, right? Like their parents said, a man's job is to provide for his family. And like they didn't make those things up, right? It's all the man on man and boy on boy harassment and hate of like man up, like I think a lot of I'm not that different in age than you are, but the like
I think like the worst slur that boys used to throw at each other was like, don't be gay, which is like, this is so wrong at every level. But I think that's like the ultimate toxic masculinity sign, is like you're threatening someone's masculinity by saying, you're not masculine. In fact, I'm going to call you gay. And I think that's the problem, right? Like if your wife has more power, or your girlfriend has more power than you do, or makes more money than you do, it's threatening your masculinity. And that you've been told for the previous 40 years that your masculinity is like the most important thing you have.
Yeah.
I think it's hard.
A lot of men are having trouble with that and the unconscious bias of that. So we should talk about that, because a lot of men do have issues with that. We've had to rediscover our masculinity. Even for me with racial unconscious bias, I had some discussions. Eddie Glaude Jr. was on to talk about his book, Begin Again by James Baldwin. And James Baldwin talks about how we're all raised, watching during that era of watching John Wayne. And a lot of my identity of being a man is very John Wayne-ish, because, I grew up watching him, and that was the influence that I had. But what I didn't realize is there's a lot of racist stuff that's in the John Wayne sort of element that speaks to America and Manifest Destiny. He's slaughtering Indians. He's always talking horrible to them, Native Americans, I should say. And I can't remember if there was anything about black people in there, but I'm sure there was, because that's how all the stupid movies portrayals were. And so even now, I've had to look back from a racial aspect on my John Wayne thing, and they're talking now about removing John Wayne's name off the John Wayne Airport in Orange County.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and so even now I'm still dealing with like, okay, we've got to unravel that thread and fix that boat.
Have you seen the Gillette? Is this the best?
Oh yeah, that's right.
I love that campaign, P&G.
And that upsets so many people.
I know. But I thought it was powerful. And it's like, and I'll say I have 2 kids. I have yesterday my son turned 7 and my daughter's 8.
Oh, wow.
And I live this stuff, but after that video had a big impact on me. I'm like, we have to make sure. And my son's huge. Like he's going to be like 6'4". Like he's really, and he's beefy, like really, really big kid. And we're like, we don't want him to grow up with that, right? Because he could totally be that person who's like doing keg stands, like football player, like big, jerk, I guess. Not that all football players or keg standers are jerks, but
let's not have unconscious bias.
I know. I just like that's my unconscious bias is like against football players. Apparently,
there you go.
We're like here, we have to make sure that he doesn't think that's the way he's supposed to behave, and like never say things like, oh, boys will be boys, or, it's not. It's like you treat people with respect. You are kind to everyone, not just like, I think the other thing is the never hit a woman, or you can't chase a girl, or like, why don't you just say don't hit anyone, right? So we say like, don't hit anyone, and especially don't hit any girls. But because that's still kind of, it's a tough balance. We want to make him a good person, but we also want to make sure there's like some balance there. Your Chris Voss show is blowing away.
Oh, is it? My huskies are coming in and out, and so they're blowing they're hitting the green screen there. One of the issues that men have, and I can speak from first person here, is we have this kind of interesting way of dealing with each other, especially men, and it's hard for us when we first have to learn that we have to deal differently with women. And we have this I'm not sure the correct term, but we give each other a lot of crap. You may know better because you're schooled and stuff. I went to public school, and Betsy DeVos is public school, and as men we there's this what would you call it, a culling, or we part of our relationships with each other as men is we break each other's nuts. It's probably the best short way to put it. There's a lot of that abuse that we give to each other, and a lot of it is it's almost maybe in thinking of it, you've given me some thoughts here. Maybe it is a masculinity sort of beat my chest sort of thing, and then I beat my chest and he beats his chest, let's go kill the dinosaur, some sort of
and get the girl
basis. Yeah, let's go get the girl. Cavemen, kill the beast and bring it back home. Tribalism, it's like some sort of tribal sort of. I'm at a loss for the correct.
They call it hegemonic masculinity.
Is that what it is?
Yeah.
There we go. You went to college. I just started business at 18 and skipped the whole thing. Clearly. But that's why I'm here, so I can learn from smart people like you. We put smart people in the room, as the beginning of the podcast says. So yeah, we have that sort of issue. And then I remember having to learn to deal with women differently, because I'm like, wow, I can't insult women and do the things that I do with guys, because it doesn't work the same.
Yeah.
like they take it seriously when, and even then, like when I was in relationships, it was hard sometimes because that sort of guy would come out and then she'd be upset, rightly so. And you'd be like, Chris, man, you can't treat her like other guys, dude. She's different. And so maybe that's a real issue with our toxic masculinity and how we have those norms of society. I remember years ago I went to this show that was it was something like the Cave Woman show, and it toured around different opera houses and show places, and it talked about sort of our basic element of our psychology from a caveman, cave woman sort of element. You had the caveman is a forget the term, a woman is a gatherer, hunter. There's the hunter-gatherer syndrome, or not syndrome, but psychosis. Well, it's a psychosis really when it comes down to it. It's still around. And so those elements probably play into our unconscious bias coming up through our psychologies, right?
I think so. I mean, it's funny, the story you said about treating women, because I think that's why we just have to say we have to treat everyone well, because I had there's another business prof I know who got in a bunch of trouble for mistreating women. And the argument was that it's not a gender thing. He's just a jerk to everyone. And maybe it's true, but it was also like, that's a really hard argument to say, like, no, he's not gender biased. He just sucks. Like, either way, you suck, right? So
yeah, you're a horrible person. Go.
Yeah, so he totally got in trouble. So I feel like there is the, like, yeah, of course you might have to change behavior a little bit, the way you treat women, but I think there's also, like, this is 2020 professionalism means that you don't, like, I can't think of how to say this without using a cuss word, but like that you don't treat other men that way either, because a lot of men hate it too, right? Like, pretty much I read this statistic, like, men have higher rates of suicide, depression, anxiety, and like a lot of it ties back to this fact that they're, like, treated horribly and they can never talk about it and they never seek any help. And so I kind of feel like we say, like, oh, well, women can't handle it, but it's like, you know what, men can't handle it either. They're like really suffering because they're being mistreated all the time and by their friends, right?
Yeah. And a lot of them are lost in their masculinity and what it identifies, because we've seen masculinity starting to change over the years. In fact, we've seen the rise of these incels, and they can't figure out their masculinity either and how it fits into societal norms, or at least the norms that they were raised on, and now the changes that are being made out there and their unconscious biases. So as we wrap up, what's the best way that the average person listening to this can start maybe doing an internal search of what maybe sort of unconscious biases they have?
Yeah, I think I will say go to my website, drstefjohnson.com, and there's a bunch of videos of different talks and stuff that I've given that talk about unconscious bias in a really, like, practical way that I think people find useful. I think that is a great first step. They can read Inclusify. They can read other Blind Spot is a good book about unconscious bias. And, like, this isn't rocket science, like, it's new and it's different, but people can certainly start to become aware of their biases and then find ways to, like, mitigate them. And this is the time to do it, right? Because if, 5 years ago you were like, okay, I'm going to change and be this, like, new person at work, it might be weird, but right now I think, first of all, you don't see anyone at work because your home. So when you show up again, no one's seen you in like 5 months. So it's not weird to be different. And people expect that we're all trying to learn together right now and be better. So if not now, when?
Yeah. And you bring up an interesting point earlier on about how not all people are just bad. They just have these unconscious biases. Although, unfortunately, the results of their behavior from those unconscious biases is bad. So people have got to just get in touch with them. Listen, learn, get your book, try to understand what this is about, grow, change. I think that's what's made it easier for me going through life is that there's, I understand that change is a necessary factor and an important factor in growth. But a lot of people don't want to change. Change is, it's scary, Yeah,
but if people have been listening to your podcast for the last few weeks, like I think they're probably interested in change.
Hopefully so, because that's what we try to do is give them tools like what you've done with your book to improve their life and improve their professional life too, not only from a society basis, but a lot of these things that we've talked about today, Me Too and Black Lives Matter and racial diversity, LGBTQ diversity, all those sort of things are elements that if you step over that line or cross that line, you could be out of a job and you could end up with cancel culture where you're put into the you're kicked out of the tribe because you're bad for the tribe. So as we wrap up, Stefanie, anything more we need to know about you and the great book you've written?
I don't think so. Just thank you so much for having me. I enjoyed our chat. It was hilarious. I think you may have missed your actual career destiny as a comedian.
Ah, yes. Well,
not an entrepreneur / podcaster.
There's still that. There's still that. There's still time, right? Yeah. We need to be able to go into a comedic thing, but I mean, that's half the reason people listen to me is for the funny. So be sure to go check out her book. Give us the .com so people can look that up on the interwebs.
It's inclusifybook.com, but you can actually get it anywhere books are sold. It's called Inclusify, published by HarperCollins. You can get it at Barnes & Noble or Target or Amazon, on Kindle or ebook or hardcover, everywhere you go.
Pick it up, make it a gift. You've got plenty of time, guys. You're sitting at home a lot of times. Read a book, learn about what's going on. And I really support this stuff because I want to see us change the society until we can be, whether it's a better company or a better America or a better any country in the world, or just as a humanity, for those of us who believe the John Lennon Imagine thing, where we're all just one group of human beings that should care and lift each other up. Learning about this stuff is super, super important. I encourage you to come back anytime, Stefanie, to talk about this. In fact, we've got some other, I think we have some other panels that are coming on for inclusivity. I'll send you an email, and Dr. Lawrence Chatters has been on a few times. He's the inclusivity professor I mentioned. I think him and some another author we interviewed recently with male toxicity and male roles and ability of children. Might be good to have you come on as a panelist for that. But to all my audience, be sure to check out our book, order it up. Do that internal in perspective. Look inside and go, what kind of unconscious biases do I have? Start listening to what you see, what you feel, what your biases are. And just because society said that's what they were or what they used to be, they may not be tomorrow. So you definitely want to adapt and get with the times, if you will. There you go. So thanks a lot for tuning in. Be sure to subscribe to the show, refer the show to your friends, neighbors, relatives. Give us a great referral. Go to itunes.com. Give us 5 stars if you love the show and what we do here. We're always trying to make it better, and that will help everyone see and hear it more and get the word out. Also, go to youtube.com/Chris Voss. Hit that bell notification so you get all notifications of everything we do. Thanks, Amani. Stay safe. Be well. Take care of each other, and we'll see you next time.
Bye, Chris.
All right.